So in Arrow's framework, the social welfare functional must satisfy a number of reasonable properties, reasonable axiom. And the first axiom is the pareto property. The social welfare functional is Paretian if for any pair of alternatives, x and y, and given a preference profile so every individual in the society has a preference between x and y, and given this profile of individual preferences, i.e. rankings of x and y, we must have that x is socially preferred to y, and here this is the social preference, right here, x must be socially preferred to y if x is preferred to y by every individual in society, right? So for all individuals, if we have that all individuals prefer x to y, then the social preference must reflect this as well. So that's the Paretian property. The second requirement is that the social welfare functional satisfy the property of a universal domain. And this property means that there must not be any limitations on the set of preferences of individuals to which the functional can be applied. So we can take a look at any possible combination of individual preferences, any preferences at all here. Any possible combination of such preferences must yield a social ordering. So we must be able to define our social welfare functional regardless of the individual preference relations. And we can accommodate any underlying individual preferences, so that we are not placing any restrictions on the kinds of individual preferences, or rather on the nature of those individual preferences. So the next property is that of non-dictatorship. There must be no individual in society whose preference relation determines the social preference. So an individual I could be said to be a dictator if for any state of affairs, X or Y, and given the profile of individual preferences, if X is preferred to Y by individual I, if individual I prefers X to Y, then it must follow that X be socially preferred to Y as well. So the preferences, the preference relation of individual I governs the social preference relation. And this is true if there is a dictator in society. This is true for any two alternatives being ranked. Next property is that of pairwise independence, which is also known as the independence of irrelevant alternatives. And it's the idea that the social preference between two alternatives x and y is determined only by the profile of individual preferences over those same alternatives x and y. And the individual preferences over other alternatives will not affect the social preference between x and y. So to make this a bit more formal, we could consider here two profiles of individual preferences. Profile number 1 and profile number 2. Oops. Now, the only difference between these two profiles are the way that other alternatives, i.e. alternatives other than x and y, are being ranked. But the individual preferences between x and y are the same in both profiles. That is to say that so for every individual I, if x is preferred to y, then x is also preferred to y here. And if it's the other way around, if y is preferred to x, then y must also be preferred to x. What pairwise independence says is that if that's the case, then the social ranking of x and y must also be the same in those two situations. In other words, if socially, right, x is preferred to y, then it must also be preferred to y. And if y is socially preferred to x, it must also be socially preferred to x here. So if we consider the social preference relation that emerges, that is being defined over these preferences, okay, the social ranking that emerges, right, here and here, from our social welfare functional must be the same. And it must be the same. Why? Well, because the ranking, the individual rankings of x and y haven't changed in those two situations. And so if the only thing that's relevant to determining the social preference is individual ranking of x and y, and if those rankings haven't changed, then the social ranking must also be the same. So what Arrow's impossibility theorem holds is that if the number of social alternatives being considered is at least 3, i.e. 3 or greater, then there does not exist a social welfare functional that simultaneously satisfies all of the properties we've just looked at, while at the same time also being rational at the social level. In other words, a social welfare functional cannot be transitive and also satisfy the 4 properties we've just looked at, namely the Paretian property, the non-dictatorship, the universal domain, and the independence of irrelevant alternatives, which is also known as the pairwise independence condition. So if we want to satisfy these 4 seemingly mild and reasonable properties, we have to have an intransitive, i.e. irrational, social preference relation. So this is somewhat of a troubling, puzzling result that shows the incoherence or perhaps undesirability of many practical preference aggregation mechanisms, which includes, by the way, majority voting. And it's not a particularly intuitive result, could not really have been anticipated without this axiomatic framework. However, this result was known in the particular case of majority voting as Condorcet's paradox as early as the 18th century, which I'll talk about in a second. So what we'll focus on going forward is first, how do you prove this result? And second, how do you interpret this result?